This is my house. I have every right to be here. You can't throw me out.
Ma'am, I can and I will. You are being arrested for trespassing and resisting eviction.
I need to get my daughter's arrest is illegal.
Ma'am, stop resisting. I'm not going to ask you again.
Ma'am, you have exactly 60 seconds to produce proof of ownership, or you're going to jail for trespassing. The words cut through the humid afternoon air like a blade, captured in crystal clarity on Officer Derek Mitchell's body camera as his hand instinctively moved toward the service weapon holstered at his hip. The date stamp on the footage read June 14, 2024, and the location was 4782 Willow Creek Lane, one of the most exclusive addresses in Riverside Heights, where the median home price hovered around $2.3 million and the lawns were maintained with almost religious fervor. Standing in the front yard of this particular property, her hands still dirty from the rose bushes she'd been planting along the walkway, was a woman who had no idea that the next 18 minutes of her life would be recorded, dissected, and eventually become evidence in a federal civil rights investigation that would shake this entire community to its foundation. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, no relation to the officer currently treating her like a criminal, and the tragic irony of what was about to unfold was this. Sarah wasn't a squatter, she wasn't a trespasser, and she most definitely wasn't committing any crime. She was standing in the front yard of a house that had been legally gifted to her, deed transferred and notarized, by one of the wealthiest and most respected men in the entire state of California. But that man, billionaire philanthropist Raymond Hartwell, wasn't there to verify her story because at that exact moment he was lying in a medically induced coma in the intensive care unit of Mercy General Hospital, 14 miles away, his fate uncertain and his voice silenced at precisely the moment Sarah needed it most. What Officer Derek Mitchell didn't know, what none of the neighbors who had called in the complaint could possibly understand, was that he was about to make the most catastrophic mistake of his 12-year law enforcement career, a decision that would cost him his badge, his pension, his reputation, and potentially his freedom. What the smiling faces watching from porches and perfectly manicured lawns didn't realize was that their coordinated campaign of harassment, their months of calculated cruelty, and their absolute certainty that they had every right to drive this woman from their neighborhood was about to be exposed in the most public and devastating way imaginable. And what Sarah herself couldn't have known as she watched the officer's hand move toward his weapon was that in exactly 48 hours, Raymond Hartwell would open his eyes, learn what had been done to her, and unleash a reckoning that would leave careers destroyed, fortunes lost, and an entire community forced to confront the ugliness they had tried so hard to keep hidden behind their pristine white picket fences. But this story doesn't begin with Sarah's arrest, and it doesn't start with the smug satisfaction on Barbara Henley's face as she watched from her living room window, cell phone in hand, already composing the neighborhood group chat message that would celebrate this victory. No, to understand how everything went so catastrophically wrong, we need to go back 6 months earlier, to a time when Sarah Mitchell had nothing but a 13-year-old Honda Civic with a broken passenger window, a 7-year-old daughter named Maya who asked too many questions about when they'd have a real home again, and a determination that refused to be broken no matter how many times life knocked her down. If powerful stories, voices, and black triumphs matter to you, subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV. Like, comment, and share so these stories travel further. Sarah Mitchell's fall from stability into homelessness hadn't been dramatic or sudden. It had been a slow, grinding erosion of everything she'd worked to build, the kind of descent that happens when you're a single mother with no safety net and life decides to hit you with everything at once. She'd been a certified nursing assistant at Riverside Community Hospital for 6 years, working double shifts when she could get them, living in a modest apartment in the section of town where the paint peeled and the sirens were so frequent you learned to sleep through them. The money was never quite enough, but it was steady, and steady was everything when you had a daughter depending on you. Then came the diagnosis, stage 2 breast cancer, discovered during a routine checkup that Sarah had almost skipped because she couldn't afford to take the time off work. The treatment was aggressive, necessary, and absolutely devastating to her finances even with insurance. The medical bills piled up faster than she could pay them, and when she had to reduce her hours because the chemotherapy left her too weak to stand for 12-hour shifts, the careful balance she'd maintained for years collapsed entirely. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who wouldn't meet her eyes, and by Friday she and Maya were living in the Honda, parking in different locations each night to avoid being moved along by police or security guards who saw them as a problem to be solved rather than people in crisis. Maya was 6 years old when they lost the apartment, and Sarah watched her daughter transform from a chattering, energetic child into someone quieter, more careful, as if she understood that taking up too much space, physical or emotional, was now a luxury they couldn't afford. They kept up appearances as best they could, with Sarah driving Maya to school each morning from whatever parking lot they'd spent the night in, helping her change clothes in the back seat and using wet wipes and bottled water for their morning routine. Sarah told herself it was temporary, that she'd find a way out, that her cancer was in remission and she just needed time to get back on her feet and rebuild what had been destroyed. The abandoned farm property wasn't something Sarah had been looking for. She'd literally stumbled across it while taking a longer route to avoid traffic, driving down rural roads on the outskirts of Riverside Heights where the expensive neighborhoods gave way to agricultural land that had been slowly bought up by developers waiting for the right moment to build. The property sat behind a rusted gate that hung crooked on its hinges, and through the gaps in the overgrown vegetation Sarah could see what had once been someone's dream. A 15-acre farm with a main house, a barn that was slowly collapsing in on itself, and fields that had gone wild with weeds and volunteer plants that had taken over completely. She drove past it 3 times before she finally pulled over and walked up to the gate, Maya trailing behind her with the cautious curiosity of a child who'd learned that new places could be dangerous. The gate wasn't locked. The chain that had once secured it lay broken in the grass, rusted through from years of neglect, and Sarah pushed it open with a creak that sent birds scattering from the nearby trees. The driveway was barely visible under the encroaching vegetation, and as they walked toward the main house Sarah found herself cataloging everything that was wrong. Broken windows, a porch that sagged dangerously on one side, gutters hanging loose and filled with years of accumulated debris. But she also saw the potential, the bones of something beautiful underneath all the decay. The fruit trees that lined the driveway were still alive, just overgrown and in desperate need of pruning. The fields, though completely wild, had good soil. She could tell from the robust weeds that nothing had poisoned or depleted it. And the barn, despite its dramatic lean to the left, still had a solid foundation and good bones that could be salvaged by someone who knew what they were doing and had the time to invest. "Mommy, can we live here?" Maya asked, and the question broke Sarah's heart because her daughter shouldn't have to look at a property this rundown and see it as a potential home. "No, baby," Sarah had replied, kneeling down to Maya's level and brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "This belongs to someone else. We're just looking." But she came back the next day and the day after that, and within a week Sarah had made a decision that was either incredibly stupid or divinely inspired, depending on how you looked at it. She started working the property, treating it like it was already hers, like she had every right to be there, clearing brush and pulling weeds and slowly, methodically bringing order to the chaos. She told herself it was temporary, that she was just using it as a safe place to park at night where nobody would bother them, and that doing some cleanup work was her way of paying rent to whoever actually owned this forgotten piece of land. Sarah wasn't a farmer and she'd never done landscaping professionally, but she'd grown up in rural Georgia where her grandmother had maintained a garden that fed half the neighborhood, and those childhood lessons came back to her now as muscle memory. She worked in the early mornings before taking Maya to school, and in the evenings after picking her up, and slowly, so slowly that she almost didn't notice it herself, the property began to transform. The driveway became visible again, cleared of the vegetation that had swallowed it. The fruit trees, properly pruned for the first time in years, began to look less like wild things and more like the carefully cultivated specimens they'd once been. She couldn't do anything about the house itself, that would require resources she didn't have, but she could make the land around it beautiful, and somehow that felt important, like she was proving something to herself about who she was and what she was capable of even when everything else had fallen apart. What Sarah didn't know was that she was being watched, and had been for 3 weeks, by the actual owner of the property, a man who'd been driving past periodically to check on the farm he couldn't bear to visit but also couldn't bring himself to sell. Raymond Hartwell was 78 years old, a widower of 3 years, and a man whose personal fortune was estimated at somewhere north of $400 million, though he'd stopped paying attention to the exact number years ago when it became clear that he had more money than he could possibly spend in one lifetime. He'd made his fortune in commercial real estate development, buying undervalued properties and transforming them into spaces that served their communities, and he'd been ruthlessly successful at it not because he was willing to cut corners or exploit people, but because he genuinely understood that the best investments were the ones that made everyone involved better off. The farm had been his wife Eleanor's passion project, purchased 30 years ago when they'd both been younger and still believed they had unlimited time to pursue every dream they'd ever harbored. Eleanor had grown up on a farm in Kansas, and she'd spent decades talking about getting back to that life, to growing things and working the land and living at a pace that wasn't dictated by quarterly earnings reports and board meetings. When Raymond finally bought her this 15-acre property, she cried from happiness, and for 2 years they'd spent every weekend here together, planning the gardens and orchards they'd plant, the life they'd build once Raymond finally retired and they could dedicate themselves to this place full-time. Then Eleanor had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and 18 months later Raymond was alone, standing in the farmhouse they'd barely begun to furnish, wondering how he was supposed to want anything at all when the person he'd wanted to share it with was gone. He'd locked the gate behind him that day and hadn't been back since, couldn't make himself return to a place that was supposed to represent their future together but now only reminded him of everything he'd lost. For 3 years the property sat abandoned, deteriorating month by month as nature reclaimed what humans had briefly tried to tame, and Raymond told himself he'd deal with it eventually, that he'd either sell it or donate it to some organization that could use it, but he never actually took action because that would require confronting memories he wasn't ready to face. His lawyer had sent him periodic updates about property taxes and maintenance issues, gentle reminders that the place was falling apart and needed attention, but Raymond had ignored them all, paralyzed by grief and unable to move forward or back. Then, driving past the property on his way back from a business meeting in Sacramento, Raymond noticed that the gate was open, and his first reaction was annoyance that someone was probably using his land as an illegal dumping site or a place to party where they thought no one would notice. He pulled over with the intention of calling the sheriff's department, but something made him get out of the car instead and walk up the driveway, and that's when he saw her. Sarah was on her hands and knees in what had once been Eleanor's planned herb garden, pulling weeds with methodical precision and occasionally stopping to examine the soil or identify a plant that had somehow survived years of neglect. She was so focused on her work that she didn't hear him approach, and Raymond found himself standing there watching the stranger tend to his dead wife's dream with a care and attention that he himself hadn't been able to muster in 3 years. He visited twice more that week without announcing himself, parking down the road and walking up quietly, just observing. He watched Sarah work the land with a dedication that went far beyond someone just looking for a temporary place to crash. He saw the careful way she pruned the fruit trees, the research she must have done to know the proper techniques. He noticed the little girl who did homework on a blanket under the shade of the old oak tree while her mother worked, and the way Sarah would stop periodically to check on her, to bring her water or a snack from a cooler they kept in their car. And he saw something else too. The car they were living out of, the clothes they changed in the barn, the way they packed up everything each morning like they were erasing evidence of their presence. Raymond Hartwell hadn't become successful by being unobservant, and he recognized homelessness when he saw it, recognized the quiet desperation of someone trying to maintain dignity in circumstances that were designed to strip it away. It was the roses that finally broke him, the day he watched Sarah carefully plant 6 rose bushes along the walkway to the house. Varieties that Eleanor had talked about wanting but never gotten around to buying. Sarah couldn't have known that she'd somehow chosen the exact cultivars that his wife had circled in gardening catalogs and talked about planting, when we finally have time, but Raymond knew, and something in his chest that had been frozen for 3 years suddenly cracked open. He approached her on a Thursday afternoon, walking up the driveway without trying to hide his presence this time, and he watched Sarah's face cycle through surprise, fear, and then resignation as she realized she'd been caught. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, standing up and brushing dirt from her jeans with hands that trembled slightly. "I know this is your property. I saw the tax records at the county assessor's office. I wasn't trying to steal anything or damage anything. I've been homeless for 4 months and this seemed abandoned and I thought maybe I could stay here temporarily and do some work to pay for it, make it better instead of worse. I can leave right now if you want. I'll pack up everything and you'll never see me again." Raymond looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd been beaten down by circumstances but refused to be broken by them, someone who'd responded to losing everything by trying to create something beautiful instead of destroying it. He looked past her at the transformation she'd wrought over the past month, at the land that looked more alive than it had in years, and he made a decision that his lawyer would later call either incredibly generous or phenomenally stupid. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle in a way that seemed to surprise Sarah. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, and then, because honesty seemed important in this moment, "This is my daughter Maya. She's 7. We've been living in my car since February when I lost my apartment. I had breast cancer and the medical bills. Everything just fell apart. But I'm in remission now and I'm working part-time at a grocery store, and I'm saving up for a deposit on a new place. This farm, what you have here, it's beautiful. Or it was, and it could be again. I've been trying to restore it because it seemed wrong to let something this special just die, and because..." She trailed off, searching for words. "Because working here makes me feel human again. Like I'm building something instead of just surviving." Raymond was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke his voice was thick with emotion. "My wife's name was Eleanor. This was supposed to be her farm, our retirement project. She died 3 years ago and I haven't been able to come back here since because everywhere I look I see what we were supposed to have together. I've been letting it fall apart because I couldn't face it, couldn't make myself care about it when she wasn't here to share it. He walked over to the rose bushes Sarah had planted, touching the leaves with gentle fingers. These were her favorites. She talked about planting David Austin roses along this exact walkway. How did you know? I didn't, Sarah admitted. They felt right for this space. Like they belonged here. She would have liked you, Raymond said, and then he looked at Sarah with an intensity that made her nervous. I want to show you something. Can you take a drive with me? Both of you? Sarah hesitated. She'd learned to be careful about getting into cars with strangers, about trusting offers that seemed too good, but something in Raymond's face made her agree. They drove in his Mercedes, Maya wide-eyed in the back seat at the luxury of it all, and Raymond took them across town to Willow Creek Lane, where the houses were set back from the street behind gates and professional landscaping, where the air itself seemed expensive. He pulled up in front of a 2-story colonial with cream-colored siding and black shutters, a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about gracious living. I own this property, Raymond explained. I bought it 15 years ago as an investment, and it's been occupied by renters for most of that time, but the last tenant moved out 4 months ago and I haven't bothered to list it again. The property taxes are paid through the end of the year, the utilities are still on, and it's sitting empty while I figure out what to do with it. He turned to look at Sarah, and what he said next would change the trajectory of her entire life. I want to give it to you. Full deed transfer, no mortgage, no strings attached except one condition. I want you to keep working the farm at least once a week, keep it alive the way you've been doing. Eleanor's dream doesn't have to die with her if you're willing to keep it growing. Sarah stared at him like he'd spoken in a language she didn't understand. You want to give me a house? This house. You've already proven you know how to take care of something precious, Raymond said quietly. You could have trashed that farm, could have stripped it for anything valuable and moved on, but instead you made it better. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. Eleanor always said you could judge a person's character by what they do when no one's watching, and Sarah, I've been watching and I've seen enough. What happened over the next 3 weeks was something Sarah still couldn't quite process even after it was done. Raymond's lawyers drew up the paperwork, verified Sarah's identity, and executed a clean property transfer that left no room for legal ambiguity. The deed was transferred, notarized, and filed with the county recorder's office. Sarah Mitchell became the legal owner of a property valued at $2.3 million, and the only thing she owed in return was a promise to keep an old man's memories alive by tending to his late wife's garden. Every story here is bold. Every voice matters. If Bold Black Watch TV moved you, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and help us amplify Black stories about justice that deserve to be heard. Moving day should have been one of the happiest moments of Sarah's life, the culmination of a journey from homelessness to homeownership that most people would have considered impossible, but the reality of arriving at 4782 Willow Creek Lane with their meager possessions packed into the Honda was complicated by the immediate and obvious fact that they were not welcome here. Barbara Henley was waiting on her front porch across the street when Sarah pulled into the driveway, her expression carefully neutral in that way that people deploy when they want to observe without appearing to judge. She was 63 years old, recently retired from a career in real estate that had left her comfortably wealthy and perpetually concerned with property values, and she'd been the Homeowners Association president for 7 consecutive years because no one else wanted the job and because Barbara genuinely enjoyed the authority it gave her to enforce the standards she believed kept Willow Creek Lane special. She watched Sarah unload boxes from her beat-up Honda with growing consternation, her mind already cataloging violations both real and imagined. That car would have to go. It was an eyesore that brought down the aesthetic of the entire street. And was that child wearing clothes from Target? In Willow Creek Lane, where even the dogs wore designer collars and attended obedience training that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Barbara gave Sarah exactly 20 minutes to settle in before walking across the street with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a basket of muffins that she'd baked that morning for another purpose entirely but that now served as a convenient excuse for this introduction. She rang the doorbell with authority, the kind of ring that suggested she expected to be answered promptly, and when Sarah opened the door with Maya peeking out from behind her mother's legs, Barbara deployed the smile again. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, extending the basket. "I'm Barbara Henley, HOA President. I live in the house directly across the street, the one with the blue door and the professional landscaping. I like to make sure all our new residents understand the community standards we maintain here." "Thank you," Sarah said, accepting the muffins with genuine gratitude because she hadn't had time to go grocery shopping yet and Maya would be hungry soon. I'm Sarah Mitchell and this is my daughter Maya. We're so excited to be here. Mr. Hartwell has been incredibly generous. Barbara's smile flickered just for a moment at the mention of Raymond's name. Yes, Raymond mentioned he'd be placing someone in this property. We were all very surprised. He usually prefers to rent to families who've been vetted through the proper channels. Are you working as his property manager, or? The question was phrased delicately, but the implication was clear. Barbara couldn't fathom that Sarah actually owned this property, couldn't imagine a scenario where Raymond Hartwell would transfer a multi-million-dollar asset to a woman who showed up in a car that looked like it belonged in a junkyard. I own it actually, Sarah replied, and she saw Barbara's eyes widen fractionally before the older woman reasserted control over her expression. Mr. Hartwell transferred the deed to me. I have all the paperwork if there's any question about it. That won't be necessary, Barbara said quickly, though her tone suggested it absolutely would be necessary at some point in the near future. I'm sure everything is in order. I just wanted to drop by and let you know about our community guidelines. We have standards here: lawn maintenance requirements, approved color palettes for exterior painting, noise ordinances that are quite strict especially regarding children playing outside after 7 p.m. I'll have my husband bring over the full HOA handbook tomorrow. It's quite comprehensive. She paused, her gaze moving past Sarah to scan what she could see of the interior. Will you be making any modifications to the property? Any exterior changes would need to be submitted to the HOA Architectural Review Board for approval, of course. No changes planned, Sarah assured her. We're just happy to be here. Wonderful, Barbara said, and the words sounded like a threat. Well, I'll let you get settled. Welcome to Willow Creek Lane. I'm sure you'll find that we're a very particular community. The visit set the tone for everything that followed, and over the next week Sarah met her other neighbors through a series of encounters that ranged from coldly polite to outright hostile. There were the Robinsons, a retired couple in their 70s who asked if Sarah was the new housekeeper and seemed genuinely confused when she explained she owned the property. There were the Carters, a younger family with 2 teenage boys who looked at Maya like she was a stray dog that had wandered into their gated community. And there was Preston Vanderbilt, a corporate lawyer who lived in the largest house on the street and who made a point of walking past Sarah's property 3 times in one day, each time stopping to examine her lawn or her mailbox or some other detail with the air of someone cataloging evidence. Raymond visited that Friday as he'd promised he would, making the weekly trip from the farm where Sarah had spent the morning pruning fruit trees and clearing drainage ditches. He pulled up in his Mercedes and walked to Sarah's front door with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere he went, and when Sarah invited him in for coffee he accepted gladly, settling into her modest furniture with the ease of someone who didn't equate comfort with luxury. How are you settling in? He asked, and something in Sarah's expression must have given her away because he frowned. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Sarah said quickly, then reconsidered because Raymond had been nothing but honest with her and she owed him the same. The neighbors they're not what I expected. Some of them don't seem to believe I actually own this house. I've had 3 people ask if I'm the property manager or the housekeeper, and the HOA president came by with a list of rules that's basically a guide to all the ways I can get fined for existing here. Raymond's jaw tightened. Barbara Henley came by, I assume? Is she always that intense? Barbara is deeply invested in maintaining what she calls the character of this neighborhood, Raymond said carefully, which is code for keeping out anyone who doesn't fit her very narrow definition of acceptable. I've had run-ins with her before over various issues. She threatened to fine me once because my lawn service missed a week and my grass was a 1/4 inch too long. A 1/4 inch, Sarah. The woman measured it. Should I be worried? Sarah asked, and she hated how small her voice sounded, how easily the old fears crept back in. Fears of losing everything again, of having stability ripped away just when she'd started to believe it might last. No, Raymond said firmly. You own this property free and clear. The deed is filed, everything is legal and above board. Barbara can rattle her HOA handbook all she wants, but as long as you maintain the property to basic standards, which you already do better than half the people on this street, there's nothing she can do. And if she tries anything at all, you call me immediately. I've been dealing with people like Barbara my entire career. She doesn't scare me. He reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand, a gesture that was fatherly and kind. You belong here just as much as anyone else on this street. More, actually, because you earned this through character and hard work, not inheritance or corporate bonuses. Don't let them make you feel like you don't deserve to be here. Those words sustained Sarah through the following months as the Homeowners Association's campaign of harassment began in earnest. A coordinated effort so subtle in its execution that it would have been easy to dismiss as coincidence if you weren't paying attention. But Sarah was paying attention, was cataloging every interaction and writing down dates and times with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned the hard way that documentation mattered when you needed to prove your case. The first formal HOA violation notice arrived 3 weeks after she moved in, delivered via certified mail and citing her for maintaining grass that exceeded the approved height of 2.5 inches. Sarah measured her lawn immediately. It was exactly 2.25 inches, well within compliance, and she took photographs with a ruler visible in the frame before composing a response that was polite but firm. The violation was withdrawn, but 2 weeks later there was another notice, this time claiming that the exterior paint color didn't match the approved palette even though Sarah hadn't painted anything and the house was the exact same color it had been when Raymond's previous tenants lived there. Then came the noise complaints, filed by Barbara Henley and co-signed by Preston Vanderbilt, claiming that Maya's outdoor play was disturbing the peace. The complaint specified that Maya had been screaming in the backyard at 8:30 p.m., past the community's 7 p.m. noise curfew, but Sarah had documentation proving that Maya had been in bed by 7:45 that night, tucked in and reading quietly before falling asleep by 8:15. When Sarah presented this evidence, the complaint was amended to claim the violation had occurred on a different date, a date when Sarah and Maya hadn't even been home, having spent the evening at the farm with Raymond. The police call started in month 3, and they followed a pattern that Sarah quickly recognized as coordination rather than coincidence. Someone would call to report suspicious activity at her address. A black woman observed entering the property through a back door, a vehicle that didn't match neighborhood standards parked in the driveway, an unknown child playing in the yard. Each time, officers would respond to find Sarah either working in her garden, collecting her mail, or simply existing in her own home, and each time they'd run her identification, verify her ownership of the property, and leave with expressions that ranged from apologetic to annoyed that their time had been wasted. Sarah documented everything. She installed security cameras at every entrance to her property after the 5th police call, recording not just her own activities but also capturing footage of Barbara Henley photographing Sarah's house from the street, of Preston Vanderbilt walking his dog past her property 6 times in one evening, of the coordinated way her neighbors would gather on porches to watch whenever Sarah left or returned home. Raymond visited every week, maintaining his routine of working the farm with Sarah on Saturday mornings and often staying for lunch afterward, and his presence seemed to infuriate Barbara in a way that was almost satisfying. The HOA president made a point of being outside whenever Raymond's Mercedes pulled up, watching with barely concealed hostility as this man she'd known for 15 years chose to spend his time with someone she considered an interloper. The confrontation came at the quarterly HOA meeting, held in Barbara's living room because she refused to waste money renting a neutral space when her home was perfectly adequate for neighborhood business. Sarah attended because Raymond had encouraged her to, had told her that showing up and participating was important even when it was uncomfortable, and she sat in the back row with her documentation folder on her lap while Barbara conducted the meeting with the self-importance of someone presiding over matters of international significance rather than neighborhood minutiae. When they reached the new business portion of the agenda, Barbara's expression shifted into something that might have been satisfaction, and she looked directly at Sarah before speaking. "I want to address a concern that's been brought to my attention by multiple residents. We have a new homeowner on the street who, despite repeated guidance about our community standards, continues to generate complaints and concerns. I'm proposing that we implement additional oversight measures for properties that receive more than 3 formal complaints in a 6-month period. That's targeted harassment and you know it." Raymond's voice cut through the room, and Sarah turned to see him standing in the doorway, still wearing the work clothes he'd had on at the farm that morning. He must have come directly from there, must have known this ambush was coming and positioned himself to intervene. "Sarah has received 9 formal complaints in 4 months, and every single one has been withdrawn or proven false when examined with actual evidence. You're not implementing oversight, you're creating a paper trail to justify driving her out." Barbara's face flushed. "Raymond, this is an HOA meeting for residents only. As a non-resident property owner, you don't have standing to." "I have standing because I'm the one who put Sarah in that house, and I'm not going to stand by while you orchestrate this pathetic campaign to force her out," Raymond interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of boardroom battles. "Every person in this room knows exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. Sarah doesn't fit your aesthetic requirements. That's the real issue here. Her car isn't expensive enough, her background isn't suitable, And most importantly, she doesn't look like the rest of you. That's a serious accusation, Preston Vanderbilt said from his seat near the front, though he didn't quite meet Raymond's eyes when he said it. It's a factual observation, Raymond countered. And I'm putting everyone in this room on notice. If this harassment continues, if Sarah receives one more fraudulent complaint or one more police call based on fabricated concerns, I will personally fund a federal civil rights investigation into this HOA's practices. I have the resources and the motivation, and I promise you that what I'll uncover will be far more embarrassing than simply admitting that you've been acting like bigoted children and cutting it out. The room fell silent, the kind of uncomfortable quiet that settles over people when someone has said aloud what everyone was thinking but no one wanted to acknowledge. Barbara's hands were shaking slightly as she gripped her meeting agenda, and for the first time since Sarah had met her, the HOA president looked genuinely rattled. This meeting is adjourned, Barbara said tightly, and people filed out with their eyes down, not looking at Sarah as they passed. Raymond walked Sarah home that evening, his hand gentle on her shoulder as they crossed the street to her house. They're going to back off for a while, he said. But not forever. People like Barbara don't give up, they just get more creative about their cruelty. He had no idea how prophetic those words would be, or how little time they had left before everything would spiral completely out of control. Bold Black Watch TV is more than a channel, it's a community. Subscribe, like this video, and join us as we celebrate justice, truth, culture, and powerful Black narratives. Raymond Hartwell collapsed on a Saturday morning while he and Sarah were working together at the farm, pruning the apple trees that had finally started producing fruit again after years of neglect. One moment he was reaching for a high branch with the pole pruner, explaining to Sarah the proper angle for cutting to promote healthy growth, and the next he was on the ground, the tool fell beside him, his eyes rolled back and his breathing shallow and irregular. Sarah's nursing training kicked in immediately, checking his airway, his pulse, the responsiveness of his pupils, and even as she was calling 911 with shaking hands, she was performing the assessment that told her this was serious, potentially catastrophic. Stroke, almost certainly, and a bad one based on the left side paralysis she could already see developing and the way his face had gone slack on one side. The ambulance arrived within 12 minutes, and Sarah rode with him to Mercy General Hospital, holding his hand and talking to him continuously even though he couldn't respond, telling him about the farm and the roses and how the apple trees were finally thriving, filling the silence with words because silence felt like giving up. At the hospital they rushed him directly into emergency neurosurgery for a craniotomy to relieve the pressure from the massive hemorrhagic stroke that was, as the doctor explained to Sarah in the waiting room 3 hours later, among the worst he'd seen in a patient who'd survived the initial event. The next 72 hours are critical, Dr. Amir Kowalski explained, his face showing the particular exhaustion that comes from long hours of delicate work trying to repair what nature had broken. We've stabilized the bleeding and relieved the pressure, but there's significant damage. He's in a medically induced coma right now while his brain tries to heal. Whether he wakes up and what condition he'll be in if he does, it's too early to say. Can I stay with him? Sarah asked, and something in her voice must have conveyed the depth of her fear because Dr. Kowalski nodded even though visiting hours were technically over. You're listed as his emergency contact, the doctor said, checking his tablet. Did you know that? Sarah hadn't known. Raymond must have updated his paperwork recently, must have decided that she was the person he wanted called if something went wrong, and that realization hit her like a physical blow. This man had given her everything when she had nothing, had believed in her when no one else would, and now he was lying unconscious in an ICU bed while machines breathed for him and monitored every fragile heartbeat. She stayed at the hospital for 3 days straight, sleeping in the chair beside Raymond's bed and only leaving to call Maya's school and arrange for her daughter to stay with a co-worker Sarah had gotten to know at her grocery store job. Sarah talked to Raymond continuously during those vigil hours, reading aloud from the farming books he kept in his car, describing in detail the progress they'd made at the farm, reminiscing about the day they'd met and how her life had transformed since then. On the 4th day, when the nurses finally convinced Sarah to go home and shower and get some real sleep, she drove back to Willow Creek Lane in a fog of exhaustion and grief, her mind so focused on Raymond's condition that she almost didn't notice the unusual number of cars parked along her street. Almost didn't register that several neighbors were standing on their porches watching her house with expressions that would have warned her if she'd been paying attention. She was too tired to pay attention, was running on nothing but coffee and fear, and she walked into her house without noticing the way Barbara Henley was on her phone across the street, speaking urgently to someone while staring directly at Sarah's front door. The campaign had begun the moment news of Raymond's stroke had spread through the neighborhood, carried by the efficient gossip network that connected all these houses like neural pathways. Barbara had learned about it from her nephew Derek, who worked as a patrol officer and who'd heard about the ambulance call from dispatch. She'd immediately convened an emergency HOA meeting, just the core group, the one she could count on to understand what this opportunity meant. Raymond's incapacitated, Barbara had explained to the 8 people gathered in her living room. The doctors don't know if he'll wake up, and if he does, he'll likely have significant cognitive impairment. This is our chance to correct his mistake before he's in any position to interfere. You want to go after the Mitchell woman? Preston Vanderbilt had asked, and though his tone was cautious, he didn't sound opposed to the idea. I want to restore the integrity of this neighborhood, Barbara corrected. Raymond gave away a multi-million-dollar property to a homeless woman he barely knew. The whole arrangement is suspicious. There are legal precedents for challenging such transfers when the grantor's mental capacity can be questioned. Raymond has been acting erratically since Eleanor died. His judgment has clearly been compromised. You have proof of that? This from Dominic Fletcher, a retired judge who'd moved to Willow Creek Lane specifically because he liked the exclusivity. I have 3 years of increasingly strange decisions, Barbara replied. Letting that farm fall into complete disrepair, then suddenly giving away a house to someone he met while she was trespassing on his property? That's not the behavior of someone thinking clearly. And now that he's had this stroke, we have medical evidence of cognitive decline. The plan they developed over the next hour was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. They would gather witness testimony from neighbors about Raymond's deteriorating mental state over the past years. They would document every interaction with Sarah that could be construed as suspicious, her resistance to HOA guidance, the fraudulent appearance of her ownership documents, the concerning presence of her vehicle on the property. And they would use Barbara's nephew Derek, who had both legal authority as a police officer and personal motivation to help his aunt, to execute what they would frame as a legitimate intervention. Derek Mitchell was 34 years old, 12 years into a law enforcement career that had been adequate but not exceptional, marked by a tendency to see situations in simple binaries of legal and illegal without much room for nuance or compassion. He loved his Aunt Barbara, owed her money from when she'd helped him through a rough divorce 3 years earlier, and when she called him with this situation that needed his professional attention, he was predisposed to see it through her lens. We think this woman might have taken advantage of Raymond Hartwell during a period of diminished capacity, Barbara explained. The property transfer seems questionable, the documentation might be forged, and now that Raymond's in a coma, she's the only one who can corroborate the story. As a concerned neighbor and community leader, I think this warrants investigation. Derek had driven by Sarah's property that evening, running her information through police databases and finding exactly what Barbara had primed him to find. A woman with no credit history at this address because she'd just moved in, previous addresses listed as transient, during her months of homelessness, medical debt that suggested financial desperation. The picture that emerged was one Barbara had carefully painted. A con artist who'd manipulated a grieving elderly man into giving her a fortune. The fact that all of Sarah's documentation was legitimate, that the deed transfer had been executed by Raymond's lawyers with full legal review, that Sarah herself had done nothing wrong, these were facts that didn't fit the narrative Derek had already accepted, and so they were discarded as irrelevant details that must somehow be part of the con. Sarah had been back home for 6 hours, had finally gotten Maya from her co-worker's house and was trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy by making dinner, when Derek Mitchell knocked on her door with the kind of authoritative pounding that immediately triggers alarm in anyone who's had negative interactions with law enforcement. She opened the door to find 3 officers on her porch, Derek in the lead, 2 others flanking him as backup, and the expression on Derek's face was one she recognized from her months living in the car, the look of someone who'd already decided she was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be helped. Sarah Mitchell? Derek asked, though his tone made it clear this wasn't really a question. Yes, that's me. Is something wrong? Sarah's mind immediately went to Raymond. Had something happened at the hospital? Had his condition deteriorated? We've received reports that you might be illegally occupying this property, Derek said, his hand resting casually on his belt near his service weapon in that way cops do when they want you to know they're armed. I'm going to need to see documentation proving you have legal right to be here. Sarah's heart rate spiked, adrenaline flooding her system in the way it does when you realize you're in danger but can't yet identify the full scope of the threat. I own this house. Raymond Hartwell transferred the deed to me. All the paperwork is filed with the county. So you say, Derek replied. But we've received credible information suggesting that transfer might have been fraudulent, that Mr. Hartwell's mental capacity was compromised at the time, and that you might have taken advantage of an elderly man's vulnerability. That's not true, Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice calm even as panic started to claw at her throat. Raymond was completely lucid when he gave me this property. His lawyers handled everything. It's all legal. Then you'll have no problem producing the documentation, Derek said. Right now. Sarah went inside to get the folder she kept with all her important papers. The deed, the transfer documents, the title insurance, everything Raymond's lawyers had provided to prove ownership beyond any doubt. She brought it back to the door and handed it to Derek, watching as he flipped through pages with an expression that suggested he'd already decided none of it mattered. These could be forgeries, Derek said after a cursory examination. We're going to need to take these for verification. And in the meantime, given the questions about the legitimacy of your occupancy, I'm going to have to ask you to vacate the property. Vacate? Sarah repeated, the word not quite computing. You want me to leave my house? Where am I supposed to go? That's not my concern, ma'am, Derek replied, and the coldness in his voice was like a slap. I have an emergency order here. He pulled a document from his pocket that Sarah would later learn had been prepared by Preston Vanderbilt based on dubious legal precedent, authorizing temporary removal of occupants from this property pending investigation into the ownership question. This is my house, Sarah said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. I have every legal right to be here. You can't just throw me out based on some neighbor's complaint. Ma'am, I can and I will, Derek said, and his hand moved definitively to his weapon now, an unmistakable threat. You have exactly 60 seconds to gather essentials and exit the property, or you're going to be arrested for trespassing and resisting eviction. Behind Derek, Sarah could see neighbors gathering, Barbara Henley on her porch with her phone out, recording the whole encounter, Preston Vanderbilt standing on his lawn with his arms crossed, expressions ranging from satisfaction to outright glee on the faces of people who'd spent months trying to drive her away and were now watching their victory unfold in real time. I need to get my daughter, Sarah said, her mind racing through options and finding nothing good, no path forward that didn't end in disaster. She's inside doing homework. Please at least let me get Maya. Derek nodded curtly. 1 minute. And I'm coming with you to make sure you're not destroying evidence. The next 15 minutes would be seared into Sarah's memory with the kind of permanent clarity that trauma creates, every detail sharp-edged and inescapable. Maya's face when Sarah had to explain they needed to leave, the way her daughter's eyes went wide with fear that was too familiar, too much like the look she'd had when they were living in the car. The humiliation of packing a bag while 3 officers watched, treating her like a criminal in her own home. The sound of Barbara Henley's voice drifting across the street. Finally, I knew there was something wrong with this whole situation. Derek Mitchell's body camera captured everything that happened next, footage that would later be examined frame by federal investigators and civil rights attorneys, but in the moment it just felt like the end of everything Sarah had fought so hard to build. She tried one more time to reason with him, standing on her own front porch with a bag of hastily packed clothes in one hand and Maya's hand gripped tight in the other. Please, Officer Mitchell, please just verify the deed with the county recorder's office. Call Raymond's lawyers. This is all legal and documented. You can't do this. Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again, Derek replied, and something in his posture shifted, became more aggressive, more threatening. Step off the property now or I'm placing you under arrest. For what? I haven't done anything wrong. For trespassing and resisting a lawful order. This isn't lawful. You can't. Derek's hand closed around Sarah's arm with enough force to bruise, and Maya started screaming, and everything accelerated into the kind of chaos that looks absolutely damning when viewed without context but felt like pure survival in the moment. Sarah pulled away from Derek's grip, not attacking him but simply trying to free herself, and that was all the justification he needed to shout, "Stop resisting," and force her to the ground while Maya shrieked, "Don't take my mommy," in a voice that would haunt everyone who heard the body cam footage later. The handcuffs clicked into place, metal biting into Sarah's wrists, and Derek hauled her up with unnecessary roughness while reading her rights in a monotone that suggested he'd done this so many times it had lost all meaning. Sarah was put in the back of the patrol car, watching through the window as another officer, a woman who at least had the grace to look uncomfortable with this whole situation, tried to calm Maya down while calling Child Protective Services because they couldn't release a minor to someone who'd just been arrested. The last thing Sarah saw before they drove away was Barbara Henley standing on her porch, phone still out, still recording, and the smile on the woman's face was one of pure triumph. What did this story mean to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like and subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV for more powerful black stories. Sarah spent 36 hours in county lockup, processed through a system designed to dehumanize, stripped of her belongings and her dignity and any illusion that justice would prevail simply because she'd done nothing wrong. They put her in a holding cell with 7 other women, some of whom were clearly in the grips of addiction or mental illness, and Sarah sat on the concrete bench with her back against the wall and tried not to think about where Maya was, whether her daughter was scared, whether CPS had found a placement that was safe and kind, or whether Maya was somewhere crying for her mother who couldn't come. The bail hearing on Monday morning was a formality. Sarah had no prior record, no history of violence, and the judge seemed skeptical of the charges even as he set bail at $2,500, an amount that might as well have been $25,000 for all the ability Sarah had to pay it. She was returned to the cell, told her public defender would be in touch, and left to sit with the knowledge that she was trapped here until someone posted her bail or until her court date, whichever came first. What Sarah didn't know was that 14 miles away in the ICU at Mercy General Hospital, Raymond Hartwell's eyes were opening for the first time in 3 weeks. His return to consciousness wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was a gradual process of neural pathways reconnecting, of his brain slowly reasserting control over a body that had been running on automatic pilot while he was gone. The first thing he became aware of was the breathing tube, the uncomfortable presence of something foreign in his throat, and then the beeping of monitors, and then the presence of another person in the room. Dr. Kowalski was there immediately, shining lights in Raymond's eyes and asking questions to assess cognitive function. "Mr. Hartwell, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you understand." Raymond squeezed, his grip weak but present. "Do you know where you are?" A pause and then a slight nod. "You're in the hospital. You had a stroke, but you're going to be okay. We're going to remove the breathing tube now. This might be uncomfortable." The extubation process left Raymond coughing and disoriented, his throat raw and his voice, when he finally managed to speak, barely more than a whisper. "Sarah?" he managed. "Where's Sarah?" The nurse exchanged a glance with Dr. Kowalski, the kind of look that passes between medical staff when they're not sure how to answer a patient's question. "Mr. Hartwell, you need to rest. We can talk about visitors once you're more stable." "No," Raymond rasped, with more force than seemed possible given his condition. "Sarah Mitchell. She should be here. She was with me when it happened." "Where is she?" "She was here for the first 3 days," the nurse explained gently. "She stayed with you constantly. But she hasn't been back since Thursday. It was Monday afternoon." Raymond had been unconscious for 21 days, and in his absence, his entire world had shifted in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. "Call her," he demanded, with the kind of authority that even a stroke couldn't completely diminish. "Call her now." The nurse tried Sarah's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail because Sarah's phone had been confiscated as part of her arrest and was sitting in a property bag at the county jail. Increasingly alarmed now, his mind still foggy but his instincts screaming that something was very wrong, Raymond demanded his own phone, his lawyer, anyone who could explain why the woman who'd been his constant companion for 6 months had suddenly vanished. His assistant, Jennifer Casper, arrived within the hour, her expression carefully neutral in that way people use when they're about to deliver bad news. She'd been managing Raymond's affairs during his coma, handling business decisions and fielding calls from concerned associates, but she'd been deliberately kept in the dark about what was happening on Willow Creek Lane because Barbara Henley and her allies had known that Jennifer would have intervened if she'd known. "There's been a situation," Jennifer said carefully, pulling a chair close to Raymond's bed. "It concerns Sarah Mitchell and the property you gave her." What she explained over the next 15 minutes sent Raymond's blood pressure spiking high enough that the monitors started alarming, bringing nurses rushing in to check on him. The arrest. The eviction. Maya being placed in foster care. The criminal charges Sarah was facing. The coordinated campaign by the Willow Creek Lane HOA to paint the entire property transfer as fraudulent, to characterize Raymond's decision as evidence of mental decline rather than deliberate generosity. They arrested her? Raymond's voice was stronger now, fueled by a rage that burned through the fog of his medical condition. They dragged her out of her own house? And you're just now telling me this? "I didn't know until this morning," Jennifer said, her own anger visible in the tightness of her jaw. "No one contacted me. They deliberately went around anyone who would have defended her. Mr. Hartwell, they waited until you were unconscious to make their move. This was coordinated and calculated." "Get me every lawyer we have on retainer," Raymond said, struggling to sit up despite the nurse's protests. "Call the police chief directly. Call the mayor if you have to. I want Sarah out of jail right now today, and I want every person involved in this held accountable." "You're in no condition," the nurse began. "I don't care," Raymond interrupted. Someone dragged a woman from her home, arrested her for the crime of existing while I couldn't defend her, and traumatized her daughter in the process. They did this because they thought I'd never wake up to contradict their story. Well, I'm awake now and there's going to be hell to pay. Jennifer made the calls, and what happened over the next 6 hours was a masterclass in what happens when someone with unlimited resources and absolute moral conviction decides to weaponize their privilege in defense of justice. Raymond's legal team descended on the county courthouse like an avenging army, armed with documentation that proved beyond any shadow of doubt that the property transfer had been legitimate, that Raymond had been of sound mind, that his lawyers had verified every aspect of the transaction. They demanded Sarah's immediate release and got it, though it still took 3 hours to process the paperwork. They demanded the return of all property seized during her arrest, her phone, her documents, her dignity. They demanded an immediate meeting with the chief of police and got that too, presenting him with evidence of the conflict of interest that had compromised Officer Derek Mitchell's involvement in the case. The chief, Calvin Wright, was a career law enforcement officer who'd built his reputation on running a clean department, and watching the body cam footage of Derek Mitchell dragging Sarah Mitchell from her home while her daughter screamed was one of the most professionally mortifying experiences of his career. The optics were catastrophic, the legal exposure was enormous, and the fact that Derek was related to the woman who'd filed the complaint created a conflict so obvious that missing it constituted gross negligence. Officer Mitchell is suspended pending investigation, Chief Wright announced after reviewing the evidence. And I'm personally apologizing to Ms. Mitchell for this department's role in what appears to have been a coordinated harassment campaign. Raymond was still in the hospital, still technically on bed rest, but he insisted on being there when Sarah was released from custody. Jennifer wheeled him into the courthouse in a wheelchair, her bag attached to a portable stand, and when Sarah walked out of processing wearing the same clothes she'd been arrested in 2 days earlier, he was waiting. She saw him and burst into tears. Not delicate crying but the kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that come from 2 days of holding everything in, of being strong because breaking down in county lockup is dangerous, of not knowing if she'd ever see her daughter again or if everything she'd fought for had been permanently destroyed. Raymond stood up from the wheelchair despite Jennifer's protests and pulled Sarah into a hug that was probably medically inadvisable given his recent stroke but was absolutely necessary for them both. "I'm so sorry," he said, his own voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry they did this to you. But I'm here now and I promise you, everyone involved in this is going to face consequences." "Maya?" Sarah managed through her tears. "I don't know where they took Maya. I don't know if she's safe." "We're getting her back," Raymond said firmly. "Right now. Jennifer, call CPS and tell them we're coming to get Sarah's daughter, and if there's any delay, any bureaucratic bullshit about the process, remind them that we have the governor's personal number and we're not afraid to use it." Maya had been placed in an emergency foster home across town, with a couple who ran a licensed facility and who, to their credit, had kept her safe and treated her kindly even though Maya had barely spoken since being separated from her mother. When Sarah walked into that house with Raymond's legal team behind her, Maya screamed, "Mommy," and ran into her mother's arms with the kind of desperate relief that made everyone in the room look away to give them privacy for their reunion. The foster mother, a woman named Dorothea Lyman who'd been doing this work for 20 years, pulled Raymond aside while Sarah held Maya. "That little girl cried herself to sleep both nights," Dorothea said quietly. "She kept asking when her mother was coming back if she'd done something wrong, if they were going to have to live in the car again. I've seen a lot of children in crisis, Mr. Hartwell, and that child has trauma that goes deep. Whatever happened to separate them, it shouldn't have." "It shouldn't have," Raymond agreed. "And the people responsible are going to answer for it." They drove back to Willow Creek Lane in a convoy, Raymond's Mercedes with Jennifer driving, Sarah and Maya in the back seat holding each other like they might be separated again if they let go, followed by a second vehicle carrying 2 of Raymond's lawyers and a process server who had a very specific job to do. The house at 4782 Willow Creek Lane had been padlocked, Sarah's belongings tagged and photographed as evidence, and there was a notice posted on the door declaring it under investigation for fraud. Raymond took one look at it and told his lawyers to remove every lock, every notice, every trace of the violation that had been perpetrated against Sarah's rights. Across the street, Barbara Henley watched from her porch with growing alarm as the padlocks were cut away, as Sarah was escorted back into her home by lawyers who radiated the kind of expensive competence that suggested this was far from over. Barbara pulled out her phone, calling Preston Vanderbilt with shaking hands. "He woke up," she said, and those 3 words carried the weight of catastrophe. "Raymond woke up and he's here and they're putting her back in the house." "That's impossible," Preston said. though his voice suggested he knew it wasn't. The doctors said he might never regain consciousness. Well, he did, and we're fucked, Barbara replied with uncommon vulgarity. We need to get our stories straight, need to. She was interrupted by a knock on her door, and when she opened it, she found herself face to face with a process server who handed her a document with the kind of professional neutrality that suggested he delivered bad news for a living. Barbara Henley, he said. You've been served. These are the initial filings in a civil rights lawsuit. Have a nice day. Similar scenes were playing out at Preston Vanderbilt's house, at Dominic Fletcher's house, at 4 other properties along Willow Creek Lane where residents had signed affidavits supporting the eviction. Derek Mitchell received his summons at the police station, handed to him by his own chief along with notice that he was being placed on unpaid leave pending the outcome of both a criminal investigation and an internal affairs review. Inside Sarah's house, Raymond sat on her couch, the same couch he'd sat on months ago when he'd first visited, when he'd seen how she'd made this house a home with such limited resources, and he took her hand. I want you to understand something, he said. What they did to you wasn't just wrong, it was illegal, it was cruel, and it was motivated by nothing but prejudice and spite. You did everything right, Sarah. You were a perfect neighbor, you followed every rule, you documented everything. And they came after you anyway because they couldn't accept that you belonged here. I don't know if I can stay, Sarah admitted, looking around at the house that no longer felt safe, that would always carry the memory of being dragged away in handcuffs while her daughter screamed. Every time I see Barbara across the street, every time I remember Maya being taken from me, I don't know if I can live with that. You can, Raymond said gently, because they're not going to be here much longer. Barbara's going to lose her house paying legal fees and settlements. Half these people are going to move out of shame once this becomes public. And the ones who stay are going to have learned a very expensive lesson about trying to drive out someone who has the law, the documentation, and a very angry billionaire on her side. He was right, though neither of them knew yet just how completely the scales would tip in Sarah's favor over the coming months. The lawsuit that Raymond's legal team filed was comprehensive in its scope and devastating in its documentation, naming not just Officer Derek Mitchell but also Barbara Henley, Preston Vanderbilt, Dominic Fletcher, and 4 other Willow Creek Lane residents who'd signed affidavits supporting Sarah's eviction. The charges included civil rights violations, conspiracy to deprive rights under color of law, false imprisonment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and the damages being sought totaled $6 million. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah's meticulous documentation of every HOA violation, every police call, every hostile interaction. The body cam footage of Derek Mitchell dragging her from her home. The testimony of Dr. Kowalski, who confirmed that Raymond had been completely lucid and of sound mind when he executed the property transfer 6 months before his stroke. The paper trail showed Barbara Henley's relationship to Derek Mitchell and the obvious conflict of interest that had been ignored. The testimony of neighbors who hadn't participated in the harassment but had witnessed it, some of whom came forward with expressions of guilt about their silence. Derek Mitchell was the first to fall. The internal affairs investigation concluded within 3 weeks, finding that he'd violated department policy on multiple counts: failure to disclose a conflict of interest, failure to properly verify documentation before executing an eviction, use of excessive force during an arrest, and providing false information in his incident report. He was terminated, lost his pension eligibility, and faced criminal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law, which carried a potential sentence of up to 10 years if convicted. Barbara Henley fought the lawsuit initially, convinced that her attorneys could somehow spin this into a case of legitimate community concerns rather than targeted harassment. She lost that confidence when her lawyers reviewed the evidence and quietly suggested she should consider settlement to avoid a trial that would expose her motivations in the most public way possible. She refused, insisted on her day in court, and learned the hard way that righteous indignation is no defense against documented facts. The trial lasted 6 days and became a local media sensation, with reporters filling the courtroom to document every excruciating detail of how a wealthy white community had coordinated a campaign to drive out a black single mother who dared to accept a gift they felt she didn't deserve. Barbara's testimony was particularly damaging to her own case, as she repeatedly referred to Sarah as someone who didn't fit the neighborhood, who brought down property values simply by existing there, who made the community uncomfortable, in ways she couldn't quite articulate without sounding exactly as racist as she was. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning a verdict that awarded Sarah $6.2 million in damages, split among all defendants based on their level of involvement. Barbara Henley's portion was $2.1 million, more than her house was worth, more than her retirement savings, essentially the destruction of everything she'd built over her lifetime. Preston Vanderbilt fared only slightly better at $1.8 million, and by the time all defendants' shares were calculated, the message was clear. Hatred has a price, and these people would be paying it for the rest of their lives. Derek Mitchell's criminal trial came 3 months later, and watching him take the stand to justify his actions was an education in how otherwise intelligent people convince themselves that cruelty is duty. He genuinely believed he'd been protecting the community, genuinely thought Sarah was a con artist who'd manipulated a vulnerable old man, and when confronted with the overwhelming evidence that he'd been wrong about every single aspect of the situation, his only defense was, "I was told by trusted sources, and I was acting on information I believed to be credible." You chose to believe those sources, the prosecutor pointed out, because they confirmed your pre-existing assumption that a black woman couldn't legitimately own a multi-million-dollar property. You chose to ignore documented evidence that contradicted that assumption. And you chose to use your authority as a law enforcement officer to validate a personal vendetta disguised as community concern. That's not a mistake, Officer Mitchell. That's a choice, and choices have consequences. The jury convicted him on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to 3 years in federal prison, suspended after 18 months if he completed community service working with organizations that serve homeless populations. Derek would serve his time, lose his law enforcement certification permanently, and carry a felony conviction for the rest of his life, all because he'd been too ready to believe the worst about someone who looked different from him. Sarah used the settlement money to establish the Raymond Hartwell Foundation, named in honor of Raymond's late wife and dedicated to providing housing assistance to homeless families trying to rebuild their lives. The foundation purchased properties in cities across California, renovating them and offering them to families at cost with low-interest mortgages and support services to help them succeed. In the first year alone, the foundation housed 47 families, including 12 single mothers who'd been living in their cars with their children just as Sarah once had. Raymond recovered from his stroke more fully than his doctors had expected, regaining most of his mobility and all of his cognitive function, and he threw himself into working with Sarah on both the foundation and the farm that had brought them together. The farm became a community space, offering programs for at-risk youth and job training for people trying to re-enter the workforce after incarceration or homelessness. Eleanor's dream hadn't died with her, it had transformed into something even bigger, touching more lives than she'd ever imagined. Willow Creek Lane changed too, though not always in ways the remaining residents appreciated. Barbara Henley's house went into foreclosure when she couldn't pay the judgment against her, and it was purchased by a family from Nigeria who were delighted to find such a beautiful property in an established neighborhood. Preston Vanderbilt sold his house at a loss and moved out of state, unable to face the daily reminder of his role in Sarah's persecution. 3 other defendants sold and left, and the new families who moved in were diverse in every sense of the word, racially, economically, culturally, and they made it very clear that the old exclusionary culture of Willow Creek Lane was dead and would not be mourned. 6 months after the trial concluded, Sarah sat on her front porch with Maya, watching her daughter play with the children from the Nigerian family across the street, and Raymond pulled up in his Mercedes for their weekly Saturday farm visit. He climbed out of the car moving a little slower than he used to, still carrying some residual effects from the stroke, but his smile was genuine when he saw Sarah. "Ready to work?" he asked, and Sarah nodded, grabbing the bag she'd already packed with work gloves and water bottles. At the farm, they worked side by side pruning the apple trees that were now producing fruit so abundant they'd started donating boxes to local food banks. Maya helped in her own 7-year-old way, more hindrance than help but learning nonetheless about plants and growth and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful through patient work. "I've been thinking," Raymond said as they worked, "about why this all happened the way it did. And I keep coming back to the same conclusion. They couldn't accept that you belong here because they'd convinced themselves that belonging is something that's given based on who you are rather than earned based on what you do. They saw themselves as naturally deserving of their places in that neighborhood, and they saw you as fundamentally unsuitable no matter how well you maintained your property or how respectfully you interacted with them. Do you think they've learned anything?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Barbara hasn't," Raymond replied. "She'll die believing she was right and the world was wrong. But some of them. I think some of them saw themselves in that courtroom testimony and didn't like what they found. Dominic Fletcher approached me last week. He wanted to make a personal apology separate from the legal proceedings. He said he'd spent his whole life thinking of himself as fair and open-minded, and having to confront the fact that he participated in something so cruel forced him to reevaluate everything he believed about himself. Did you accept the apology? Sarah was curious despite herself. I told him to apologize to you, not to me, Raymond said. It's not my forgiveness he needs. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, and then Raymond spoke again, his voice softer now. Eleanor used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone's watching. It's what they do when no one's watching and there's nothing to gain. You passed that test before I ever gave you this property, Sarah. You restored a dying farm because it felt wrong to let it die, not because you expected anything in return. That's character. That's integrity. And no amount of prejudice or legal maneuvering can take that away from you. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears this time, the kind that come from being seen and valued for who you actually are rather than being judged for who people assume you to be. I couldn't have done any of this without you, she said. You gave me more than a house, Raymond. You gave me proof that I was worth believing in. You already had that proof, Raymond countered gently. I just had the privilege of being the first person to see it clearly. They finished their work as the sun began to set, loading pruned branches into Raymond's truck to be hauled away, and Maya ran between the rows of fruit trees with her arms spread wide like she was flying. Sarah watched her daughter, this child who'd been traumatized by their months of homelessness, who'd been further traumatized by watching her mother arrested and dragged away, and saw resilience there, saw healing happening in real time. She's going to be okay, Raymond observed, following Sarah's gaze. Children are remarkably resilient when they have at least one adult who loves them unconditionally and fights for them. You've given her that, and it's more valuable than any house or settlement could ever be. They drove back to Willow Creek Lane as the streetlights came on, and when they pulled into Sarah's driveway, she noticed that the Nigerian family across the street had their porch lights on and were grilling in their backyard, and the smell of spiced meat drifted across the street along with the sound of children's laughter. It was such a normal scene, such an ordinary display of people living their lives, but after everything she'd been through it felt almost revolutionary. This was what they'd fought so hard to prevent. This casual integration, this acceptance of difference, this transformation of their exclusive enclave into something more diverse and therefore more interesting, more alive, more reflective of the actual world beyond their perfectly manicured lawns. They'd lost that fight and Willow Creek Lane was better for it. Sarah tucked Maya into bed that night, reading her favorite book about a caterpillar who transforms into a butterfly, and when she asked, "Mommy, are we going to have to leave again?" Sarah could answer with absolute certainty, "No, baby. This is our home and nobody can take it away from us. Not ever again." Raymond called that evening before heading back to his own house across town, checking in as he did most nights since his stroke because they'd both learned how quickly life could change, how important it was to maintain connections while you had the chance. The foundation approved 3 more families today, he reported. That's 50 families housed in our first year. Eleanor would have loved this. She would have loved you, Sarah said. She would have been proud of what you've built in her memory. We've built, Raymond corrected. This is as much yours as mine, Sarah. Maybe more because you understand what it means to need this kind of help in a way I never could. After they hung up, Sarah stood at her living room window looking out at Willow Creek Lane, at the street that had tried so hard to reject her and that she'd fought so hard to claim. The lights in various houses glowed warmly against the darkness, and she could see families moving around inside, living their lives with the casual confidence of people who believed they belonged exactly where they were. She belonged here too, not because someone had given her permission or because she'd won some legal battle, but because she'd earned this place through the same determination and integrity that had carried her through homelessness, through cancer, through single motherhood, through every challenge life had thrown at her. Home wasn't a place you were tolerated, it was a place you were valued, and Sarah Mitchell was valued now by Raymond and by the new neighbors who'd moved in and by her daughter who'd never again have to ask when they'd have a real house. This was home, and it was real, and it had cost her more than most people would ever know to claim it. But standing here in the house that Raymond had given her and that she defended with everything she had, Sarah understood something fundamental about justice and dignity and belonging. They aren't gifts. They're rights. And sometimes you have to fight like hell to make the world acknowledge what should have been obvious all along, that you deserve to be here, that you've earned your place, and that no amount of prejudice or privilege gives anyone the right to take it away. On her phone, a text message appeared from Raymond. The farm is hosting its first community event next Saturday, Job Fair and Resource Expo for families transitioning out of homelessness. Eleanor Foundation is sponsoring. Can you help me set up? Sarah typed back immediately, wouldn't miss it for the world. Because this was what victory looked like, not just surviving, not just reclaiming what had been taken, but transforming pain into purpose and using her experience to help others who were walking the same difficult road she traveled. Barbara Henley and her allies had tried to drive Sarah out because they couldn't accept that she deserved to be here. Instead, they'd helped create something far more powerful. A woman who knew exactly what she was worth, who had the resources to help others claim their own worth, and who would spend the rest of her life making sure that what happened to her, the harassment, the discrimination, the casual cruelty of people who thought they had the right to determine who belonged and who didn't, would be harder for the next person to endure. The lights of Willow Creek Lane glowed on, and Sarah Mitchell stood in her window, a formerly homeless single mother who now owned a multi-million-dollar property and ran a foundation that would change thousands of lives, and she smiled. Home wasn't where you were tolerated. Home was where you were valued. And Sarah Mitchell was finally, irrevocably home. If powerful stories, voices, and black triumphs matter to you, subscribe to Bold Black Watch TV. Like, comment, and share so these stories travel further. Every story here is bold. Every voice matters. Help us amplify justice narratives that deserve to be heard.